Abraham Lincoln had a clear plan for rebuilding the nation. Those plans were interrupted 4 days after this speech when he was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The Union had won the military conflict against Confederate states, but that didn't mean Southerners were ready to change as a requirement for re-entering the Union. In today's lesson, we will learn about some of the reforms made after the Civil War and Southern resistance to them. Your learning goals are to define Reconstruction and describe what would be needed to achieve it, describe Reconstruction-era reforms that were made to address civil rights for Black Americans, and describe ways that some Southerners resisted reform after the Civil War. Reconstruction was just what it sounds like. The South needed to be rebuilt physically, economically, and politically. Future presidents and Congresses would focus on the political and economic aspects of bringing the country back together. There were a variety of attitudes about Reconstruction. President Lincoln wanted healing and hoped to find the smoothest possible path to reintegrating Southern states into the Union. However, many radical Republicans wanted punishment for Southerners and to make them work hard to rejoin the Union. They should have to show that they valued being part of the country and that they were willing to embrace reform, right? Well, despite Lincoln's lenient policies, the president was assassinated in 1865, only a few weeks into his second term. And as a whole, Southerners opposed reform and clearly didn't want to make the changes that were being asked of them. This wasn't going to be easy. Many goals lay ahead for Presidents Johnson and Grant. States needed to be readmitted to the Union legally so they could have representation in Congress and the Electoral College. Southern transportation networks and buildings needed to be repaired or replaced. Citizenship and civil rights had to be ensured for recently emancipated people. And some sense of national unity needed to be restored so that the nation could heal and move forward. Changes would have to be made to the Constitution so that these ideals would be upheld. Let's see what these leaders were able to achieve. The Reconstruction era saw 3 new constitutional amendments. Under President Lincoln, the 13th Amendment ended the practice of slavery nationwide. This amendment achieved more than the Emancipation Proclamation, officially making the ownership of another person a federal crime. Under President Andrew Johnson, the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship for all natural-born Americans, and it ensured that all citizens, natural-born or otherwise, had the same privileges and rights regardless of race. This included voting and legal rights, like due process and the use of courts. And under President Ulysses S. Grant, the 15th Amendment prevented states from passing laws restricting the right to vote on the basis of race, which all Southern states tried to do. More on that soon. A final major reform during the Reconstruction era was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau helped with food, clothing, medical care, and legal services for emancipated people. It established schools and colleges to provide education for children and adults who wanted it. It helped with finding jobs and negotiating fair wages in job contracts as Black Americans looked for work. And it provided legal assistance, including helping them to assert rights such as voting or claiming land to start their own farms. A variety of political leaders helped to implement and enforce these changes. Northerners, rudely called carpetbaggers by some Southerners, traveled south to run for office. Southern supporters of Reconstruction, called scalawags, also sought election to government posts. And many Black politicians were elected to local, state, and national positions, including Hiram Revels of Mississippi, the first Black U.S. Senator. Now, in spite of these accomplishments, Reconstruction wasn't a universal success. Southerners opposed to reform found ways to resist and subvert unwanted laws. A primary tactic was intimidation and violence. The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, formed to terrorize black Southerners to scare them and prevent them from voting or running for political office. Confederate redeemers ran for office to resist Reconstruction and create black codes that would replace slave codes. Redeemers also found ways around the 15th Amendment by suppressing the black vote without specifically targeting race. All Confederate states had grandfather clauses, which were provisions in laws used to prevent people from voting unless their grandfather could vote. This targeted black Americans whose grandparents were enslaved. Poll taxes were also implemented, requiring people to pay a fee to vote. Redeemers said the taxes paid for elections and were necessary, but this wasn't true. The goal was to prevent poor people from voting, which disproportionately affected black voters. Literacy tests, or reading tests, which were required in order to vote, were implemented across the South. Slave codes had restricted enslaved people from learning to read, and many remained illiterate during their first opportunities to cast ballots. Voting laws required someone to be able to read a ballot in order to vote. But these tests were also used after it became more common for black citizens to be able to read. Simple questions were given to white voters, many of whom couldn't read very well either, while unreasonably complicated or unanswerable questions were given to black voters. In the end, Reconstruction failed to achieve some of its goals, leaving the country segregated, and with black citizens still suffering due to a lack of representation and fewer rights and freedoms than white citizens. This prevented black Americans from advancing economically and politically for several decades, which you'll investigate more thoroughly in a future course. Let's review what we've learned. Although the Civil War was over, there was still much to do. The Reconstruction era was an attempt at rebuilding. The federal government, dominated by Republicans, under Presidents Lincoln, Johnson, and Grant, made huge strides by ratifying the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and establishing the Freedmen's Bureau. Southerners were so resistant to the new changes that President Lincoln was assassinated. The Ku Klux Klan was formed, and at every turn, Redeemers sought election to work against Reconstruction. Despite these setbacks, by ending slavery, the United States was slowly moving in a direction that aligned more closely with the ideals that Thomas Jefferson had written into the Declaration of Independence 100 years before, that all men are created equal and that they have inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a future course, you'll deepen your understanding of the Reconstruction era and move forward into the 20th century, which had its own adventures and challenges. We hope to see you there. Until then, historians, remember to always be clever. Hey!